Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. Welcome everybody to the Classical Queer Podcast. Today we're so thrilled to have Kym Dillon with us from Australia. Kym, we usually ask people to start with a bit of a bio, but I will prep it and say that you are a composer and a performer, speaker, and a pianist mainly. Yes, correct? I think so.
Yeah, that's right. It's a composer mainly, I suppose. Everything kind of orbits around that.
That's your method of entry for composition, maybe. But I'd love to hear a bit about your background, and I always tell people it can be as music-y, as academic-y as you like, or it can be none of the above, and you can just tell us about who you are as a human, and we can go from there.
Wow. Yeah, where do I begin? I feel like what ties all of my musical stuff together is that I just love music, and exploring that love and that curiosity seems to flow into lots of different forms, with composition being sort of the main outlet of it. So I've started writing music since I was quite young. I started piano at 7 years of age, but even a few years after that, I started writing little pieces. And I think even before I learned piano, I was recording my favorite theme tunes from PC games and movies onto cassette so I could listen back to them, because I was really into scores even back then. And so I seemed to show this kind of curiosity for music since I was quite young. And that's what's kept me going this whole time, is a curiosity, wanting to learn more and wanting to express more of my love of music. But even though I was really creative throughout high school and doing music stuff, I never really connected that to the idea of being a composer as a sort of career. Like that, they seemed like different worlds to me. Like you've got the world of music with abstract creation, all that kind of fun, and then you've got the worldly world of making an income and things like that. And it was only when I thought about doing film scoring and I thought, oh, that's a way that you can make these things work. I'll do that, because I loved movies, as a lot of young composers do. It was kind of a gateway drug, the whole film score thing. But as I studied composition at university, the more I learned about Hollywood, the less I wanted to anything to do with that system. And I was sort of cast adrift at that point, because I'd fallen in love with art music while I was at university. I hadn't been exposed to many of these things before then. I didn't know who Stravinsky was before I got to university. And so I didn't really have a model in my head of what a freelance composer or a freelance artist would look like. And that's something that developed in the years after I finished my undergrad, where I figured out that I wanted to write just because I love writing. That was always the impetus behind it. And that started to flow into creating my own work myself, putting on my own concerts, things like that, performing my own work, which was, a model I had to come to over time, while realizing that writing and creating was just an aspect of my being, just something I had to do. And I wouldn't care if people listened to it or paid me for it or anything like that. I would do it anyway. Happy to say that these days people do like to listen to it and occasionally support me to write things. But it's been that kind of journey where more and more over time, I've realized that my creativity for composition is like the central part of what I do, and has now become sort of the larger part of my career. Whereas I've always been a musician. I work as a jazz pianist, as an accompanist, as a choral conductor, as a speaker for pre-concert talks before orchestral concerts, all sorts of stuff, all of it music, but it all kind of orbits around this love of creating and curiosity. That felt like quite a waffle, but hopefully there was some sort of sense of narrative in that answer.
No, I think it gives us a good snapshot of exactly where you're kind of coming from. I'm always curious when people, because I teach in a university, and so I see people kind of enter from all different backgrounds and sides of music and things, what their entry point is. And so you say, like so many people, that before you got to university, that kind of art music, classical music, however you want to phrase it, was kind of new to you. Who were your entry points? I mean, who did you really glom onto first? Maybe Stravinsky, but
Stravinsky was a big one, certainly. Oh, it's hard to cast my mind back that far because I remember the ones that I have really, really fallen in love with now. But I think Stravinsky was one of the first. Like, I think I asked my first year composition teacher, like, who should I be listening to? Because I knew that I didn't know things. And he said, listen to The Rite of Spring. It's like the best work of the 20th century. Those were his words to me. And never having heard anything like it before, the first time I listened to it, I got certain bits of it. The main thing I noticed is I was really into a show called The Mighty Boosh back then, which was a BBC comedy show from the mid-2000s. And the first thing I noticed was, like, when I heard the Augurs of Spring, that second movement, that was from one of the episodes of Mighty Boosh, because Julian Barrett, who did the music for that show, has popped in all of these like orchestral art music references in there. And so I started noticing those links there. And so, of course, fell in love with those movements first. But the more and more I listened to it, I really just became engrossed in it, and it took me away. And it's one of those works that even now I go back to, it continually surprises me. But that was something like I'd never heard before. And the experience of going back to something continually and having it envelop you more and more and getting more and more lost in it, that was a new experience for me too, which has been a massive thing I've loved about art music, was that sense of these giant abstract worlds that a composer can create and draw you into more and more over time, so that you feel like you're actually gaining more and more with every next listen. That's something that I first got from The Rite of Spring, I think. But on top of that,
I would say that's probably something that you put into your music.
I think so, yeah. I mean, in terms of long stuff, like I really got into Mahler as well, things like that, and a little opera and things like that. And I just loved the feeling like that I entered into some sort of dreamscape, and then an hour later came out of it and you felt like you were a changed person, like you've been through some Alice in Wonderland style journey. And that idea has really taken hold of me, and it's the kind of thing I love to create myself as my works have progressively gotten, like, I haven't gotten to Wagnerian lengths yet. I usually just tend, I never endeavor to say, I'm going to write this long sort of thing. It's usually the ideas I have tend to be ones that take their course over, at least 20 minutes or something like that. And I had found in my post-undergrad years, where I was still writing shorter pieces of music, that I would pack too much in. They would be too dense in a 5-minute piece, because I just had lots of ideas and imagination and I wanted to do everything at once. And then an audience member would be completely confounded by it, because I had put in all of these codes and symbols, but like you couldn't crack it unless you knew what you were listening for. And so I think I just naturally come to the conclusion that what I like to do is tell narratives over longer periods of time. And I think I'm a big lover of cinema too, and that's probably played into it, because cinema usually takes its course over, substantial period of time. I haven't read anything the length of a movie, but I think that form of storytelling has leaked into my subconscious in certain ways.
Did you find that having got into the music in a sense by Stravinsky and Mahler, did you then go back to older music and start thinking, hey, I need to listen to Bach and Mozart and, even earlier people? Did you sort of go back and go through the whole sort of process of going through the history, as it were?
Absolutely. Yes. You really hit on something there, because I knew I didn't have the background that I thought a composer should have, because I didn't have a classical upbringing. And so that sense of inadequacy, if you will, fueled a quest I had of like continual self-study, which I've never stopped doing. And so the best illustration of this might be a teacher that I really respected, who I met in third year. He also took a liking to me, and he said, Kym, have you read the new Richard Taruskin Oxford History of Western Music that just came out? I think you'd like it. And I took that seriously. And I don't know much of anything about the history of classical music. So for my 21st birthday, I got all 5 volumes of it. They're up there, I think, on my on my shelf. I got all 5 volumes of it, and I read the whole series cover to cover over that year or something with pencil markings for things, because again, I felt that I didn't know things, and the way that I approach that is systematically study things and go through. And to this day, like, I'm still finding my blind spots and addressing them one by one. A couple of the pieces I'm writing at the moment are sort of Baroque context, like one of the ensembles I'm writing for has Baroque instruments in it. And so I'm aware of quite a lot of Baroque music, and I love a lot of Bach and know quite a lot of Bach and have read a fair amount about him. But as for the rest of the Baroque period, I felt really in the dark. So I'm like, okay, now's the time. Let's get out some books. And every time I read about a composer, I will then go and make a playlist of them on Spotify. So I've been very systematic about it, and have been on the lookout for things I didn't know in order that I could sort of fill in the blanks. And the thing is, I start this process about self-education, but I end up always falling in love with certain composers and finding things I never would have found otherwise, and then coming out really in love with certain names that I had come across just through this process of its self-education. But I come out of it all the richer for it. But yeah, that's a big part of my continuing journey, I think.
I think it's kind of interesting, as somebody who hasn't got a big musical education, it's kind of nice to hear somebody who's really good at music sort of floundering a little bit with the history of music, because it's something, you know. I mean, I'm quite old, and I'm still discovering music and things from the past that are kind of interesting. So I kind of think it's brilliant to hear that, and you know, I'm sure that's going to make a difference. You know, every time I hear something, it makes a difference to the way I listen to music. So I think that's a really constructive thing. I think it's great to be able to look, you know, expand that horizon like that.
Thank you. And yeah, it feels exciting for me, because it's fun to know that you don't know things, and feel like you're continually discovering things, and there's always something new to find. And I think it has influenced the way I write as well, particularly in the last couple of years, where it's become more in my consciousness that this is part of my background as a composer now, this sense of that I didn't grow up with these things, and I've had to do a lot of self-study, because it means that I don't take it for granted, or at least I try not to, that that my work speaks. I know what it's like to be on the outside and feel like you're not good enough to understand this music or something. Like, and certain pieces by, like, you know, the more modernist composers like Boulez or so, who I do love, I've had to listen quite a lot to their music and think about it more and more, and think, what are they trying to say, before I eventually fell in love with it. And I was questioning a lot a few years ago, like, do you have to, is modern music always going to be like that? Is it the kind of thing where it's like, unless you listen to this multiple times and study what I'm trying to say, this is off limits to you? And like, there must be a way to be uncompromising in your language, yet still be always keeping in mind the outside listener, and be trying to invite them into it. And I think that's become a large part of my language now, is I don't wish to dumb down my ideas, and I can't anyway. Like, my imagination does wild things, and I go where it wants to go. But I'm always thinking of someone who doesn't listen to art music, and who hasn't submerged themselves in art music history like I have chosen to do. And how can the music itself actually be leading you down the rabbit hole, so that you feel like you've got some grounding in this experience, yet go into this strange land that the composer is bringing you into. So I try to do that with music, but I also do a lot of speaking before my own works. It's something I'm very passionate about, and people have told me they appreciate it. I like to be a composer that stands up and actually thinks carefully about the framework an audience has before they hear a work. I like to talk about it in a way that actually gets them ready to experience it the way I would like them to experience it. because I, although I would like to have the idealist view that a lot of work just speaks for itself, I think for a lot of contemporary audiences who aren't submerged in this world, it's really, really helpful to have some sort of a framework going into something, so that you can enjoy it the most that you can on a first listen.
I think that's fantastic. I mean, every time mainly a conductor, and it's so nice to be able to work with composers that want to talk about their work. There's so many times where I'm conducting something and it's weird and complex and strange and complicated. And I love your phrase. You said unwavering with your language, or
uncompromising. I think
I should have remembered your wonderful turn of phrase. Uncompromising with your language. And that's great, and then that's fantastic. But then sometimes you say, "Would you like to say anything about it?" They're like, "No, it speaks for itself." And then you just present this bizarre, strange world to people, and they really have no entry point. So it's so nice to hear you say that you'd like to talk about it. You should talk about it. It's your piece. It's great. It's something you've spent so much time building that world for people that. I love that you want to talk about it and give people a context. I think the other thing that I think when I hear you talk about your love of history and your love of past composers and kind of delving into all those different worlds, it for new music, and like I'll use that in like the broadest version of the word new music, but like it is interesting then that you use things like sonata for piano. That it gives a framework, it gives like an entry point, and whatever is held within can be kind of whatever it wants to be. Like you say, you can let your imagination run wild. But sometimes even that framework of it's going to be a sonata for flute and piano just helps people walk into that with a different mindset. But maybe you can tell us about the first piece we're going to listen to a bit, this sonata for flute.
Yeah, well, I love what you've said about the idea of writing a sonata already, because it's definitely in mind with this piece. Like for me, a sonata is just like a description of a box, or it's like, okay, I kind of have a very broad understanding of what this is going to mean, but it means that you can fill it with whatever you want, really. Whereas, like if you call a piece for flute and piano reflections of flute and piano, like people's minds are going to go off in all sorts of different directions, and you'll have to rescue it from there to say what you want to say, or not rescue it. Whereas sonata for flute and piano is like just such it says enough, and also it doesn't say much at all in the right kind of way. But this work, I sort of imagined like this work is about sort of botanical mindfulness, right? So each movement is about a certain flower, which I looked at for a very long time, and just thought, what if I write a piece of music about this flower? Because I like that idea, because flowers don't make sounds that we can hear, like with our naked ear. And like, how do you represent that into music? Like, you're going to have to get to all sorts of level abstractions to do that. And in doing so, I found that my attempt to interpret these flowers then interacted with my own memories, my own associations with color and music, all sorts of subjective things, subjective layers and refractions, if you will, to create the resulting pieces. And I thought that process was beautiful, because I think that's how people interpret the world. Like everyone looks at the same thing quite differently. And also, if you look at something so small for such a long period of time, you start to end up gazing into your own subconscious, into your own subjective way of interpreting things. And so it was a kind of a mindfulness piece, I suppose. But the idea of calling it sonata was to make that process interact with these old notions of, like, I think I called the first movement Fantasia and the second was Scherzo. And this third one, which is the one we're going to hear, was called Lento. It's like slow and reflective. But I like the idea of these kind of organic notions I'm playing with, the subjective and the subconscious, playing with these kind of old stiff ideas of form and tradition, and how those two things interact, I thought was really kind of cool as a jumping off point for people to just read into this work whatever they want to, as a kind of dreamscape thing, although there was a lot of my own subjective emotional goings on under the surface, which maybe we'll talk about afterwards. But I think that's probably enough. So the third movement is called Lento and is based on the, it wasn't the coastal tea tree, it was the coastal tea tree, Leptospermum levigatum. Don't know how good my Latin is, but yeah. You can look up the coastal tea tree. That's the flower for this third movement.
Let's take a listen then.
It's such a like hearing about your kind of impetus for the piece. It translates so beautifully. It's always funny to hear like what people wanted to write about after you listen to it, because now it seems suddenly so clear that it's about a flower. Weirdly, that it makes so much sense. From like a compositional standpoint, like what you spend time looking at flowers and thinking about how does this flower sound. What did that translate to for you for the flute? Like what? I mean, I think we can listen to it, but from your words, like what are you emulating in the flower with pitch and rhythm and timbre?
All right. So to get specific, and it was different for every movement. In this one, I was really enamored by the structure of this flower. It had like this certain really bright white petals and this kind of red ring, and then these the green center. And I thought, how can I represent that structure in music? And I thought, what if structure was like a camera, like in a camera just moving around the flower, and I arbitrarily decide when I'm going to move it towards the white or towards the red and towards the green. So it was kind of like a set of variations on these themes. And again, I don't expect you to actually listen to go, oh, that's what she's doing. It's more that was a way of me creating these dreamscapes and music that I thought was interesting but also expressive. So I looked at these elements on their own. I thought, how would I represent that whiteness or that redness? And because I have quite an overactive imagination, like I will quite quickly make associations in my head, and I'll think, this is kind of thing I want here, and that will get interpreted through piano and flute language. And that happens quite naturally. I don't write this kind of thing at the piano. I'm often thinking, just using my imagination and what I want to hear and what that part of the plant makes me think of. And then the music comes. It's hard to describe that part of the process because that's kind of the mystery of art, isn't it? But so, and it can get quite specific too. Like the red theme has the anthers of the plant, which are those very kind of alien-looking things on this particular flower. And so I kind of like the idea of them sort of springing up at weird angles and then coming to this point at the end. And so the flute's there going da 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 da, like sort of these quick, sudden gestures up. And so the theme became this idea of a gesture with a plink at the end. But everything else was up for grabs, right? Like they would have a sort of semi-improvised quality where it's like they all kind of happen at different times, but the theme was this gesture. And I think my music is getting more gestural as time goes on because it's becoming more linked in with the dramatic or like the theatrical, which is a big part of my love as well, which particularly played into a later work we're going to hear. But so there'll be quite some specific things like the anther thing, along with some very subjective things I was making. But again, that interaction of those things was what I found. I thought that idea was beautiful, and I like that strange mix of things. So that what actually comes out in the end, because it was so subjective and abstract and based on my own brain, the idea is what would come out would be something that anyone could interpret their way through. And I welcomed people reading their own meaning into the work. And I feel like that can be a throwaway line sometimes. I've heard it said like, oh, whatever, it's just what you say when, but like that was built in to the intention from the beginning, was that how can I write a work where it truly is about what you hear is what you hear, and get to a level of abstraction where people can feel disorientated. It doesn't sound like a lot of other music they hear, but yet still they can find things they can hang on to. Because amongst all the sort of strange abstract music, there are lots of major chords and major scales and gestures people might hear. Like, I don't shy away from any of that kind of thing, but I also I never try to dumb down my harmonies. Harmony is like the thing that's most dear to me, as you might be able to tell from listening to something like that, where it's like, it's the thing I care the most about.
I'm really glad you said that you didn't expect other people to image flowers, because I certainly didn't. But what I really loved about this piece for me was this interplay between the flute and the piano. I mean, it starts off fairly sparse, if you know what I mean. It's kind of, there's a lot of white space to move into, and then it almost for me was like I was in a conversation between two people, if you like, or two different thoughts between the flute and the piano, each one with a different tenor, I guess it would be, or timbre to it. So there was like, the slightly rougher piano and then the tweety flute up here. It was kind of, so it was almost for me like a conversation that went through. So I'm kind of glad you didn't expect us to pick up the flower theme, but it was, I did find particularly the space in the piece, if you know what I mean, was very meaningful, particularly at the beginnings and ends, where it sort of, the distance between notes came more sparsely, and that was kind of allowed my imagination to move into the space. So something different, but a different interpretation.
No, I totally love that. And I think you used the word white at the start, which is the first opening of it was the white part of the flower, and only using the white keys of the piano. So I'm glad that came across. It must be said though that normally I wouldn't withhold the information about it being about flowers. I think it was just the nature of how we set up this conversation. But before I perform this work, I let the audience know it's about flowers. I want people to know that, but then from that point on, it's like your imagination can do the rest. But I like people to know that was the impetus for it. Yeah.
I just want to say, because we talked a little bit about this before we heard the piece, and about your interaction with the audience here, and I think this is kind of important, because as somebody who listens to a lot of music, it's not common, I feel, that a composer actually stands up and says, hey, this is what I felt, but you feel what you like about it. I was recently at something, a year ago, when somebody who'd written this piece stood up and said something about what the piece was about, and lost everybody within the first 30 seconds by talking about which chords and progressions and this kind of thing. And a lot of non-musical people just sat there going, it's kind of irrelevant to me. What does this mean to me? So I kind of feel this is important for those not with such a musical background, is what does it do for you, rather than, hey, it's, I know it sounds terrible, a sonata, or it's this, that, and the other. What do I feel from it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been a big part of all of my work. Like my choir conducting is of community choir conducting nature, where most of the people in the room aren't training musicians, which I absolutely love. Like, they're quite big choirs I get to work with. And so I get harmonies and all sorts of things to happen, but it's all done through gesture, through analogies, through completely non-technical language, because I love that idea that you can still make these amazing things happen. You can still get people to do really cool musical things if you just explain it in a way that doesn't rely on prior knowledge and sort of elitist language. And that's leaked into my talking as well. So when I do pre-concert talks for orchestras to the audience, it's usually about the music they're about to hear, and I like to unpack it for them. And again, not rely on any of the sort of usual terms. I just like to what is the music actually doing? And you can express that using language that everyone understands, often like analogies of things which they all know from everyday life, because it does link that way. I think I was first like really empowered in this by hearing Boulez describe, I can't remember if it's his own music or someone else's, as telling the orchestra it should sound like a dripping tap. And that for me was like hearing someone of his caliber describe what the music should do. It should sound like a dripping tap. It's like, and I realized that I'd always made these little like associations between things that I've heard in real life and the things I'm trying to write. And that sort of gave me permission to think, okay, if someone up there can do that, maybe it's okay to think that way. And so that informs how I speak about music to audiences. You can do it with language that everyone understands. And so, of course, that also leads into how I write music as well. Whereas I get very technical. I have a very theory brain, but I don't expect anyone else to care about that. If one day henceforth, if someone wants to analyze anything I've written in an ivory tower, best of luck to them. And I think they'll find lots of things to keep them interested. But I'm not going to pretend that's what contemporary audiences want to know about. And I think any contemporary composer, you have to reckon with the very, very different context we're in now, that different from like the mid or early 20th century. Like it's just such a different world. And every composer has to find their own path as to how to define what it is to be a composer in this contemporary context, with audiences who don't share that tradition and that background. Like, what does it mean to communicate with that audience? I think it's something everyone has to figure out, but this is part of what, I guess, why I'm so passionate about it, because I want to connect with people. And I've found that writing in a way that intentionally wants to connect with people, and also happy to speak about your music in a way that prioritizes their accessing it. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but I think you know what I mean.
We do.
Sorry. It's quite late when I'm recording this, so
fair. Maybe we should say for everybody listening, it's quite late where you are. It's quite early where I am. Everything from here forward is as best as we can do. It's good. It's so nice. As a complete aside, my little musicology brain is so pleased, but because we've now talked about Boulez and Taruskin in such a short amount of time, but it's so nice, and I think it's the first time both of them have been mentioned on the podcast, that Boulez is such a favorite of mine as a conductor and as a writer, and of course Taruskin is just recently passed. I think he just died last year.
Oh, I didn't know that. My goodness. All right.
Such a yeah, no, very, very recently. Yeah, just passed away. But Taruskin was such a terrifying pillar of a person. There's so many stories of people meeting him at conferences and he was quite a huge human as well. Like, he was very tall. He was like 6'4" and intense. Anyway, Trust Me, Boulez. Great. Anyway, I would love to hear about your next piece that we're going to listen to, Portrait Itself. And I'm wondering where it comes from, of course, but how it connects to your ideas of writing for people and entry points, like we've been talking about, and something that I'm going to assume is fairly personal because it's called Portraits Himself. But tell us about the piece.
So this is a big one. Like, the full piece is 41 minutes or so. This is the epilogue, but this is the most personal thing I've ever written and probably could ever write. So I started a gender transition in 2021, the start of that year. And previously, I describe how I lived life as a sort of constructed self. It was entirely a performance that I was forced to enter into in order to survive in because I didn't know what had happened with my brain. Like I was born in the early 90s, and so the conversation around these things was a lot less developed back then. And so when I reached the torment of puberty, I had no idea what was going on with me. And I think as a way of surviving, I created this sort of persona, which I lived as for a long time, which worked on the outside, but I was full of despair for most of my life in a really sort of dark way. And things sort of were getting to the most extreme low point until I figured it all out, which is a very long story, in late 2020, and realized that I was, in fact, transgender, and that I now had a way of being able to save my life by transitioning, and which is all gone very well, like socially and all that, in all the other ways. But anyway, when I was going through that in 2021, I was also thinking about, how do I say goodbye to this thing I was living as, and how do I express that journey? Because I tried to articulate it to people and done that in various ways through lots of different forms of storytelling in order to communicate what was happening with me to those around me. But personally, I felt like I needed to do something to mark this moment and be able to move on and almost say thank you to this constructed character I'd made, because they'd kept me alive for so long, even though, there was all a facade in some way. So what I decided to do was set these Kierkegaard texts, which I loved since I first found them when I was 21, and I felt they represented this character. These texts from the start of Kierkegaard's book Either Or, which is the first chapter, is called Dia Somata, and these little fragments, a lot of them like darkly comedic, existentially despairing, little fragments, which I always loved, but which for me represented that self. And I remember thinking when I was 21, I should set these to music. I just love these. Little did I know that, over 10 years later, the reason I would set them would be something I would never have expected to happen. And I was fortunate to work with Stephen Marsh at the time. He was the baritone. You'll hear in the third track on the podcast as well. And he was the one who told me, Kym, I want you to write me a song cycle. Don't know what it's going to be at, just write me a song cycle. And then all of this happened in my life, and I knew what my song cycle was going to be. So it turned out being this giant setting of all these Dia Somata texts with extra texts from Kierkegaard's later work, The Sickness Unto Death, which, for any other trans listeners out there, describes the situation I've been describing remarkably accurately, to the point where I Googled like Kierkegaard transgender, and other like academics had made the same link between the ideas in The Sickness Unto Death and the experience I'm describing. And so they kind of bookended the work and in these spoken sections. And so again, the work was highly subjective and highly abstract, expressing something that could only be expressed in this kind of way. And I don't think I was necessarily doing it in order to get audiences on my side. It was more a personal, like, I have to do this as a kind of, I had in mind like the ideas of the Vikings burning ships, as a kind of commemorative act. And it worked. Like I was able to move on after that. But what I didn't expect, we had a big premiere performance last year in April with Forest Collective. I think you've had Evan Lawson on the program at some point, or something to do with him. He's a friend of mine, and so he organised that, and his ensemble, and I played piano for it, and Stephen Marsh sang it. And I was not prepared for how much it connected with audiences. Like that night is completely surreal in my mind, and the way that people connected their own stories with it, like of just having to find out who you are and deciding to be that person and get rid of the constructions and the facades on the top. People found themselves in this tale, which I think is, I don't know how that works, because like these Kierkegaard settings are very, very dark, and then The way I chained them together to tell this story was quite abstract. But look, I'll be forever thankful for it, and I'll never be able to recreate that moment in my life. And a lot of the memories that went into creating these pieces are gone now. Like I've wiped that stuff from my head and moving on. But the excerpt you're about to hear is the very, very end of the work, which is sort of the catharsis after a lot of, admittedly, a lot of it quite fun, but a lot of dark stuff, which just keeps sinking down and down until it reaches a sort of the lowest point and starts to rise up towards this final moment when the character realizes what it was that was chaining them and finds a way forward. And so the final text is taken from Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death, and it's a kind of summation of the state in which there is no despair at all, which is in relating itself to itself and in wanting to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power which established it, which when you first read it on the page is just such cold and clinical sounding language, but which for me like captured it. And so I've said it in a very, very lyrical way, and you hear the whole ensemble playing with it. And this chorale, which I've been hinting at throughout the whole piece as kind of the soul behind the scenes, now becomes the fabric of the whole orchestra. And Stephen closes the work. And then the viola plays the tune that Stephen sings up an octave, sort of suggesting one's voice going up, with me playing piano behind it. All sorts of symbolism on offer, but I think with this particular one you can feel quite openly what is being expressed.
Let's take a listen.
That state in which there is no despair at all, in relating itself to itself and in wanting to be itself. The self is grounded, transparently, in the power which established it. Itself to itself, and in wanting to be itself. The self is grounded, transparently, in the power which established
interesting choice of philosopher, Kierkegaard, I must admit. I mean, if you know, for an existential crisis, it's kind of the perfect person. I was interested though about what you said about marking your transition, and I think that's kind of an important thing. I think, and as you said, thanking the person you were before, because all of us feels that you know we're now the person that we should be, but in the past, you know, that person it did what it did to keep us here on this earth, you know, as it were. So I kind of found that interesting. I mean, you know, you wrote some fantastic music. I actually burnt my clothes, which I think is kind of the difference between us. Maybe I kind of got destructive at that point, but but I mean, without going too personally into this, you know, Kierkegaard has a very I don't know what the word to use is, a very I don't want to say Christian view, but he, you know, a lot of his talk is about Christianity and things like that, and you know how you believe in faith and this kind of thing. Did that come into your feeling at all, or was it just this kind of the existential crisis bit of it that was the sort of Kierkegaard? I'm just kind of interested. If it's too personal, don't worry. It's
that's all right. Well, Kierkegaard has many faces, and I think the one who writes Die Sonata is one of his pseudonyms. I can't remember which one. Sorry to any Kierkegaard scholars out there. Although I believe it was his own name behind the sickness unto death, which the latter work. So Die Sonata doesn't seem to link in with that side of him in any obvious way at all. Like the text seemed to just be these collection of almost journals or poems from a soul that's really in despair and trying to figure out who they are. And they work on their own terms. Like you can just read those and get into them without having to know anything about Kierkegaard around them. Whereas the sickness unto death, that phrase, of course, comes from I think it's the New Testament. I think it's the Lazarus story in the New Testament. Yeah, and so he does link it to that in some way. But the substance of the book, it seems you can very, in my mind at least, you can divorce it from that setting, like without doing it that much damage. Like I think he does link to it, especially in certain later parts of the book. But I think I was resonating so much with how it described this certain experience. So I think it's part of the fabric of his worldview. But I think he has very, very interesting ideas that don't necessarily link to that, to a specific theological framework, even though perhaps they might for him. So that wasn't really, it wasn't a part of this work. No.
I mean, I guess I wasn't linking it directly to theological, maybe, but more of a faith thing. The only reason I say that is that I guess for me, I always had some faith, and I'm using this in a very broader term, that there was a better place for me to be, and that kind of that I had the faith that transitioning would actually be my savior of my life, and I kind of. I don't know. For me, there was kind of a leap of faith. Maybe I'm being a bit too existential. Maybe I'm really pushing it here. But for me, there was a kind of leap of... Yeah. Sorry, go on.
That's a very Kierkegaardian idea, that leap of faith. And I can't remember which book that comes from, but I think maybe Fear and Trembling or something, where this is very kind of this one soul against the world, or it's like, and having to make a leap into the dark, or it's like you're going into territory which you really don't understand, but you take that leap of faith. And so, yeah, I totally can see how that would relate to the situation. I think in my case, it was more gaining clarity on what was wrong with me, as in like what had been going, because I knew something was wrong for a long, long time. Like I knew my head wasn't, something was, things were very, very dark inside, but I had no idea why. I didn't know why I got depressed when I was a teenager, and I don't know why I still was. And like, and the sickness unto death has that kind of quality. The book, I mean, it has that quality of trying to, what's the word that doctors use when they, oh my goodness, why can't I remember this word? There's like a word for when you give a label to a sickness, or you try and, anyway, whatever that word is that's eluding me for the moment.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Had that kind of thing where it's sort of diagnosing what a certain issue is that leads to certain existential symptoms, shall we say. And so that was my experience of, oh my goodness, this is the answer that has eluded me all this time. This is why I felt like I wasn't a real person. This is why I felt like I was following a script. This is why I felt like I was living in a half dream the whole time. All these varied psychological phenomena which I'd felt and taken for granted for so many years now found their solution in this. And I'm happy to say that I was right. Like, that was the answer, and it has worked. And it's like, and so my choice of that text sort of linked in with that way of looking at things as a kind of solution to a puzzle or a problem, because that was my personal experience of I guess waking myself up, realizing I had to transition. And the Diasomata work tells that kind of story. It's like it depicts this self which is locked in a cycle of continual self-construction and fluctuating identity, but then in the end has the kind of insight to figure out what's happening and then break through, and then sort of a happy ending at the end of it. So it's that kind of way of looking at it.
Yeah. Do you feel, I mean, one of the interesting things that I'm sorry to rabbit on about this, but I mean, one of the interesting things that trans people undergo is that we do spend a lot of time self-assessing ourselves and sort of, being very critique about ourselves and being, oh, we're never good enough, and we're never sort of like, how can we ever be this? There's like a cycle of continual reevaluation of oneself for many people. And this for me comes over in this work is kind of this evaluation of oneself. How has that? Oh gosh, sorry, my words have gone here. How have other people responded to this? Because do they have the same anxiety? I mean, I'm sure they do, but do you find people respond in a way non-trans people to the sort of anxiety or a crisis in this music? Do you find that?
Yes, I think they do. Like, they often haven't been specific about what it was they're responding to, because there's a lot in there, and like probably people can find any of the Diasomata texts, any number of them, which they relate to. But I think what became universal about it was the sense of, as I hinted at before, the wiping away of the facade and pretending to be someone you're not, and deciding definitively to be yourself. I think that theme seemed to be something people related to. I don't know how much they can relate to just how far down into the darkness the thing went. I would have to ask them more specifically about that.
Do you want to move on to the third piece, which is called If We Shadows, I think, and it's a work for piano and baritone, and uses Midsummer Night's Dream text. So another ambitious use of text from other places. So would you like to say something about that?
That's right. So this is the work that Stephen and I did before I wrote Diasomata, and was the last thing I completed before I transitioned as well. So I found that this part of my life has leaked into all of the stuff I'm writing. Just a quick aside that the end of the Flute Sonata excerpt, which I began writing that Flute Sonata before I had my big awakening, and I had it while I was writing it. And so at the end of the third movement of the Flute Sonata, it suddenly becomes this very, very exuberant dance, like really big, like quite rhythmical stuff at the end. And that was me being really happy that that I'd found the center of myself. Because as I was looking through this flower, I found the center of the flower and I found the center of me. So that's what I was saying before, and I was like, my own emotional journey just leaked into it in a way that I never intended someone to know, but it's just in there. Anyway, in If We Shadows, I hadn't woken myself up yet, But looking back on it now, it seems quite prophetic in the sense that I've been talking about how I felt like I was playing a character for most of my life, like I was performing it. And If We Shadows, of course, that text comes from the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, where Puck the Fairy's talking to the audience and saying, post the show, like, if anyone's offended by what you've just seen, just pretend it was all a dream, and we can leave happy together. Just write it off as being a dreamscape if you were offended by it. And I like the idea of this being this final thing I wrote, the final thing I wrote when I was performing before I transitioned. And so it's taken on a special quality for me. But I love that idea. And this also links in nicely with what we were talking about before in terms of reaching audiences and communicating with them. Because I found I fell in love with a lot of atonal music, serialist stuff, but was frustrated with how the work I had to do to get myself to the point where I could hear them properly and hear them for what they were and enjoy them was considerable. There's a reason that these works, just the so-called man in the street, probably isn't going to get it into Boulez and Webern terribly quickly, much as I wish they would. But I love this music now, and I wanted to share it with people, but I felt that there was this big obstacle in the way. And so I thought, what if I use in this piece, I'll start very melodiously in very kind of like rhythmic language that anyone can kind of get into. But then as the singer talks about, just pretend it was all a dream, it then descends into this dream world of atonal, and it actually was written with the 12-tone system, the middle section, but it becomes very gestural and very dreamscape, where and abstract, where like lots of symbols and things that happen, like a sort of animated film, I suppose, as a way of framing someone's listening to that kind of music, because it's a dream. Like, you've just fallen asleep and then things don't quite make sense anymore, but you start to take things as you would in dreams, where you don't tend to apply the same sort of rational approach as you do when you're awake. But then, if you still weren't into it, you slowly wake up, and at the end, I give you back the melody, and hoping that we can make amends and leave as friends after all of that. And so it was kind of my framing, this wanting to share the idea of atonal music with people in a way that was inviting to them, but also it's okay if you weren't into it. I'll give you the melody as we finish, just to. But then I think there's like a hint at the very, very end of some of the 12-tone stuff, just as the piano is finishing up, as a kind of maybe you're still dreaming idea.
Well, let's have a listen to it.
Shadows have offended. Think but this, and all is mended. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended. That you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. You not slumbered he. These visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme yielding, but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And as I am an honest puck, if we have unearned luck, now to scape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends. Else the puck a liar call. So good night unto you Give me your hands if we be friends, and Robin shall restore us. Amen.
The it to me, it still sounds very lush, even in its even in its devolved 12-tone serialism moments. And it's interesting that you, like you say, you still give the listener this thread, this like through line to kind of hold on to, even in the dreamscape, even in the weirdest moments, even the strangest bits. It is still a comfortable for people who are kind of walking in and listening to it moment. And I think the real beauty of that is how accessible it is. It doesn't seem forced. You're not like flipping between languages. The language is the same. You're kind of just allowing us to follow through the weirder bits, the complicated bits, and then the more melodious bits. What what do you hope people take from that when they listen to it? I guess as a maybe different way of saying it, like as a composer who's introducing the 12-tone, the serialism, the weirder bits, but bringing them through on this kind of melodious thread. How do you want people to experience it? How do you want to take them through that narrative?
I think I would hope that they have the experience you described, where they feel like they have been taken in a sort of thread throughout the whole thing. So it shouldn't feel like a disjointed, sudden moment where it's like, oh, this is different. Like, it should feel like it's just naturally kind of fall into that kind of language. And I'm glad it comes across as lush, because I think that's something that tends to happen in all my music. But I will never ever write music that is complicated for the sake of writing complicated music. Like I despise all like elitism and artifice in trying to be something that I'm not, if it hasn't come across already in the stuff I've been saying. And so, and part of my journey of coming to love 12-tone music was, and this happens a lot of undergrad people, I think, you come across it as this kind of cold thing where it's like, you must like this because this is the way of the future, this is modern music. And it's like it's treated as this kind of academic and soulless thing that you must rip your heart out and your soul in order to be a composer. But then I came across the right teachers and the right people who spoke about this kind of music with the same love that they talked about Wagner and things like that, and people who I respected and knew that they weren't trying to be pretentious, or they weren't trying to win any particular accolade. Like, they just loved it for what it was. And that really opened me up to it, where I learned that, okay, there is a beauty to this music that has nothing to do with the fact that it's seen as the music of the future, or like it's completely divorced from those narratives. It can be beautiful for its own sake. So when I write that kind of music, I do it genuinely. This is the hope anyway. I'm doing it because I want to hear those kinds of sounds, and I still organize the sounds in a way that's pleasing to my ear and fits in with my own aesthetics, and I'm still feeling what the music's going to do next, even though I'm restricting myself to the notes in this 12-tone row. I will never suddenly decide to write music I don't like for a bit. Like, I'm writing 12-tone music because I enjoy 12-tone music as much as I enjoy writing the melodious stuff too. For me, it's all music. And so I think my own harmonic sensibilities and musical sensibilities, including the lushness, will carry through from the first part into the middle into the end, even though I've radically changed the way the music is organized. And that was the hope, that people would find it easy to follow along with. And almost like for people who would think that they wouldn't like 12-tone music, it's almost like the hope is that I fool them into actually enjoying themselves through this process.
I wrote down some questions to ask you before we started this, and one of the questions that we often ask people is, was how being part of the queer community affects your music. But quite honestly, I think your music is fantastically honest and personal. We've heard 3 sort of really honest pieces, if you know what I mean. They're really personal and say things about you. So I was going to ask that question, but I think we've already answered it. We've already asked it and answered it in the music that you've provided, and I think that's, I don't know. For me, that's a really wonderful thing to be able to express how you felt about your transition, and allow other people into that space by your music, because it is a very difficult thing to explain to people. And I think what you're giving people is a sense of what it's like. And I think that is important, at least I think for me, and certainly I think for other members of the queer community. So yeah, I'm afraid you've already taken my question away, but I think it's
sorry about that.
I think it's really amazing. So hey, it's okay. I've got millions of other questions.
Thank you.
But it's fantastic. I mean,
yeah.
really, really great to have such a personal.
Thank you. Yeah. And I've been sort of surprised by how much people have found their own meanings in the works that I've written, even though they have been personal. Because I think in looking very deeply at my own psyche, if you will, I see it more as telling the story of another human being, or like the story of looking into your own psyche in a way that sort of generalizes it so that people can they can relate to the idea of looking deeply into yourself as they related to this very specific Diasomata piece. And I think I prefaced, because I spoke to the audience at length before that work, and one of the things I said was that in making this, I no longer think of it as my story. I think of it as one of our stories, like one of the stories of the human race. And enshrined in this piece in that way, it's become something external to me that people can find themselves in. And so I don't find myself thinking, please understand my music so that you therefore understand me. It's more that people tend to respond to music that's authentic and makes itself vulnerable and isn't pretending to be something it's not. And so naturally I am writing very personal music. But the hope is that then creates an experience that people can find themselves in, and not that they then necessarily get to know me better, I think. And I think that model has worked a lot in the sort of singer-songwriter kind of canon over the last 50 or so years, where it's like often singer-songwriters are writing about their own story, but the songs become something much bigger than that people can find themselves in, even though they came from a very personal place. Now, I think I like that model as a way that can be applied to creating art music as well. And I think a lot of the great pieces of art music have been like that, like especially the Romantic period. You think of like, what was Brahms going through when they wrote this thing here and here? It's like creating these great masterworks, but they came from, something that was happening in their personal life. And I'm keen not to try and dampen that process. I think a lot of good art comes from that kind of way of approaching it.
Wonderful. It's such a refreshing way to think about things. I think the idea that we create something and send it off into the world as musicians, and how it's unpacked, perceived, interpreted, whatever, you can provide a framework for it for sure, and it's absolutely connected to the person who creates it, and so on and so forth. But it is ultimately something somebody else is ingesting and kind of unwinding through their own eyes. And it's kind of the beautiful part about creating art like this, that it can be intensely personal. It can be really specific to a situation, a life, a person, an experience, but that we always hope that it translates to somebody else from their perspective, from their eyes, and how it can provide meaning for them that's not your meaning. And that's kind of a really beautiful thing. But maybe to circle back to your own specific writing, one of the best ways that we can do that is providing something that is accessible for people to ingest. It's not helpful to create that experience if they don't have an entry point, and your music is so complex and layered but accessible at the same time. And so it does allow people to hear your music and hear your story of what you're trying to say with that specific thing, but then they can take it on their own path and put their own experience into it. So thank you for writing it, but also thank you for being here to talk about it with us today. It's been really quite lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you about it, and I have loved the questions you've asked.
So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer podcast, and Jake and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music is courtesy of Jared Miller, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.